Before I get into this, I need to be straight with you about something, because it matters more than a dramatic hook. While the world was genuinely watching Japan this week, California did not experience some hidden major earthquake that slipped under the radar. I checked the actual seismic records, and there's no significant quake to report, no damage, no injuries, nothing resembling a headline-worthy event happening quietly in the background while everyone's attention was on Japan. What California has actually been doing is something quieter, and, in its own way, more interesting once you understand it properly, continuing the same constant, low-level shaking it experiences every single day of the year. A pattern that tells a genuinely important story about why this state remains one of the most closely watched earthquake zones on the entire planet, even when nothing dramatic is making headlines. This is the real story of what's actually happening beneath California right now, why scientists pay such close attention to that quiet background activity, and why the state's real earthquake risk has almost nothing to do with any single week's headlines. If you want the accurate version of stories like this, instead of manufactured urgency, subscribe now, because California's actual earthquake risk deserves to be understood correctly. Let's start with what California's seismic activity genuinely looked like during the same stretch of time, because the real numbers tell a story worth understanding on their own terms. On July 30th, a magnitude 2.4 earthquake struck a few kilometers northeast of Long Beach, at a depth of roughly 14 kilometers. Detected cleanly by well over 100 seismic monitoring stations across the region. Earlier in the month, a magnitude 2.6 quake struck near Covelo in Northern California. A magnitude 2. 0 event hit near Salton City, close to the Mexican border, and several smaller quakes in the magnitude 1 to 2 range registered around Kelseyville and Loyola in the Bay Area. None of these earthquakes caused any damage. None of them were large enough for most residents in the area to have consciously felt them at all. And that's actually the entire point worth understanding. Because activity exactly like this happens across California essentially every single day. A genuinely constant, low-grade seismic hum running beneath the state that most people never notice, specifically because it's so routine. To understand what an actual major California earthquake looks like, compared to the routine background activity covered so far, it helps to look at the state's own relatively recent history. The 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, a magnitude 6. 9 event centered in the Santa Cruz Mountains, killed 63 people and caused billions of dollars in damage across the San Francisco Bay Area, including the partial collapse of a section of the Bay Bridge and a devastating structural failure along a double-decker freeway in Oakland. 5 years later, the 1994 Northridge earthquake, a magnitude 6. 7 quake centered in the San Fernando Valley, killed 57 people and remains one of the costliest natural disasters in American history in terms of insured losses, despite striking a region that had already been built to reasonably modern seismic standards. More recently, in July of 2019, a sequence of earthquakes near the town of Ridgecrest in the Mojave Desert, including a magnitude 6. 4 foreshock followed a day later by a considerably larger magnitude, 7.1 main shock, produced the strongest earthquakes California had experienced in exactly 20 years, though the area's low population density meant the damage and casualties remained comparatively limited, despite the earthquake's genuinely significant size. Each of these events looked completely different from the routine, unnoticed magnitude 2 activity covered earlier in this video, and that difference in scale is exactly why seismologists draw such a clear distinction between California's constant background seismicity and the comparatively rare, genuinely significant earthquakes capable of producing real, headline-worthy damage. If a story built on real, verified USGS data instead of manufactured urgency is the kind of thing you want more of, drop a like on this video right now. It genuinely helps this content reach more people who'd get value out of it. To understand why that constant background activity matters, you have to understand what's actually happening geologically underneath California, because the state sits directly on top of one of the most significant plate boundaries anywhere in North America. The San Andreas Fault runs roughly 800 miles through California, marking the boundary where the Pacific Plate and the North American Plate grind past each other in a sideways or strike-slip motion, moving at an average rate of somewhere around 1 to 2 inches per year. That might sound slow, and on a human timescale it genuinely is, but the plates don't actually slide past each other smoothly and continuously. Friction locks large sections of the fault in place for years, decades, or even centuries at a time, while the underlying tectonic stress keeps building steadily beneath the surface. Eventually, that accumulated stress overcomes the friction, holding a locked section of fault together, and the rock breaks suddenly, releasing years or decades of built-up energy all at once, in what we experience as an earthquake. The small, routine earthquakes California experiences constantly, exactly like the handful of minor quakes recorded this past month, represent one visible piece of that much larger, ongoing process. tiny releases of stress happening along smaller faults and minor sections of larger fault systems throughout the state. Seismologists specifically monitor this baseline level of activity because meaningful changes in that background pattern, a noticeable increase in the rate of small earthquakes in a specific area, or a swarm of activity clustering somewhere unusual, can sometimes serve as an early indicator worth investigating further, even though the overwhelming majority of small earthquake swarms in California and everywhere else never lead to anything larger at all. If you found this more useful than the original headline suggested, drop a comment and let me know. It genuinely helps me figure out what to cover next. It's worth understanding exactly how seismologists translate all of this constant background monitoring into the kind of long-term risk estimates that actually inform building codes and emergency planning, because it isn't guesswork. The U.S. Geological Survey, working with the California Geological Survey and the Southern California Earthquake Center, maintains something called the Uniform California Earthquake Rupture Forecast, a comprehensive statistical model built from decades of accumulated data on fault locations, historical rupture patterns, and the accumulated stress along different fault segments throughout the state. That model is what actually produces the kind of long-term probability estimates you sometimes hear cited. The well-known figure that California faces roughly a 70% chance of experiencing at least one magnitude 6.7 or larger earthquake somewhere in the state within any given 30-year period, for instance. Figures like that aren't predictions of when or exactly where a specific earthquake will strike. There are statistical estimates built from the same underlying science covered throughout this video. The constant measurable buildup of stress along a plate boundary that occasionally, unpredictably, releases that stress in a large rupture, layered on top of centuries of historical data about how often that release has previously occurred along specific, well-studied sections of fault. Here's the part of California's earthquake story that actually deserves the kind of attention a dramatic headline usually reserves for something that already happened, because it involves a genuine ongoing scientific concern rather than a single event. Certain sections of the San Andreas Fault, particularly the southern segment running through areas like the Coachella Valley, haven't experienced a major rupture in a genuinely long time by the standards of the fault's own history. Paleoseismic research, essentially digging into the ground and studying layers of disturbed soil to reconstruct a timeline of past earthquakes stretching back centuries, indicates that this specific southern section of the fault has typically produced a major rupture on average, roughly every 150 to 200 years. The southern San Andreas hasn't produced a major earthquake since sometime in the late 1600s, or possibly the very start of the 1700s, based on the most recent paleoseismic estimates, meaning that section of the fault has now gone considerably longer without a major rupture than its own historical average would suggest is typical. Seismologists are careful, and rightly so, about how they frame that kind of statistic, because an earthquake fault isn't a scheduled train, and being overdue by historical averages doesn't translate into a specific, predictable date for the next major rupture. But it does explain why California's southern San Andreas Fault remains one of the most closely studied, most seriously prepared for seismic hazards anywhere in the United States, entirely independent of whatever specific earthquakes happen to make headlines in any given week. It's also worth going back further because California's modern approach to earthquake risk was fundamentally shaped by a single catastrophic event that predates almost everything else covered so far: the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, estimated at somewhere around magnitude 7. 9 ruptured a roughly 300-mile stretch of the northern San Andreas Fault and triggered fires across San Francisco that ultimately caused far more destruction than the shaking itself, killing an estimated 3,000 people and leaving hundreds of thousands homeless in a city that, at the time, had no meaningful earthquake-resistant building requirements at all. That single disaster effectively launched the modern scientific study of earthquakes in the United States, directly leading to the founding of the Seismological Society of America, and decades of subsequent research specifically aimed at understanding exactly the kind of fault behavior covered throughout this video. Every piece of California's current earthquake infrastructure, the shake alert warning system, modern building codes, the ongoing scientific monitoring of small, routine earthquakes for any meaningful change in pattern, traces its lineage in some form back to lessons learned from that single devastating event more than a century ago. That long-term concern is exactly why California has invested so heavily in infrastructure most residents rarely think about directly. The state operates Shake Alert, an earthquake early warning system developed by the U. Hess Geological Survey in partnership with the California Geological Survey and several universities, which uses a dense network of seismic sensors to detect an earthquake's initial, faster-moving waves and issue an automated alert to phones and public systems in the seconds before the slower, more destructive shaking waves actually arrive at a given location. Depending on someone's specific distance from an earthquake's epicenter, that warning can provide anywhere from a few seconds to as much as a minute or more of advance notice enough time in many cases to take cover, for automated systems to pause elevators or slow trains, and for surgeons and other professionals engaged in precise, sensitive work to pause safely before shaking actually begins. That system exists specifically because of the same long-term seismic risk driving concern about the southern San Andreas Fault, built and continuously refined over years, entirely separate from whatever specific quake activity happens to be in the news during any particular week. To put some real numbers behind just how constant this background activity actually is, the California Geological Survey and USGS monitoring networks detect somewhere in the range of several hundred earthquakes across the state in any given month. The overwhelming majority of them, like the small quakes covered at the start of this video, far too weak to be felt by anyone at the surface at all. Only a small handful of those events each year reach a magnitude large enough to be commonly felt by residents, and significant damage-causing earthquakes remain considerably rarer still, which is exactly why an actual major event, when one does occur, tends to dominate news coverage so completely. That sheer volume of routine, unfelt activity is part of why seismologists resist reading too much into any single week's earthquake activity in isolation. A handful of small quakes scattered across different parts of the state, at different depths, on different unrelated faults. The way this past month's activity actually looked simply reflects the ordinary continuous grinding of California's tectonic plates, rather than any kind of coordinated buildup towards something larger. It's also worth understanding just how much California's building codes and infrastructure planning have been shaped by the same underlying constant awareness of seismic risk. Following a series of destructive earthquakes throughout the 20th century, including the 1971 Sylmar earthquake and the 1994 Northridge earthquake, California progressively adopted some of the strictest earthquake-resistant building codes found anywhere in the country, requirements that have continued evolving as engineers learn more from each subsequent significant earthquake about which specific building designs perform well under strong shaking and which ones don't. That continuous refinement process is a direct, practical response to living with the same kind of constant background seismic activity covered earlier in this video. The small, routine earthquakes that rarely make headlines, but that collectively remind engineers, geologists, and emergency planners that the underlying hazard never actually goes away, regardless of how quiet or newsworthy any specific stretch of time happens to be. The 2019 Ridgecrest sequence mentioned earlier actually offers a genuinely useful, real-world lesson in exactly this kind of distinction, because it illustrates precisely why seismologists remain cautious about treating any single small earthquake as a meaningful warning sign on its own. The magnitude 6.4 event that struck Ridgecrest initially looked at the time like a standalone, moderately significant earthquake, the kind of event that occurs somewhere in California multiple times per decade without necessarily leading to anything larger. It was only in hindsight, after the considerably larger magnitude 7.1 main shock struck the following day, that seismologists were able to properly classify that first earthquake as a foreshock. There is currently no reliable scientific method for identifying, in the moment, whether a given earthquake represents a standalone event or an early warning sign of something larger still to come, a genuine limitation of current earthquake science that applies just as much to the small, routine quakes covered throughout this video as it did to the initial Ridgecrest event back in 2019. That uncertainty is precisely why California's emergency preparedness messaging focuses on maintaining constant baseline readiness, having a plan, securing heavy furniture, knowing your evacuation routes, rather than trying to time that preparedness around any specific earthquake or cluster of earthquakes that happens to make the news in a given week. So what does all of this actually add up to? While the world's attention was genuinely focused on Japan's earthquake this week, California experienced nothing resembling a comparable event. No significant quake, no damage, nothing that would have qualified as breaking news by any honest standard. What California has actually been doing is what it does essentially every day, registering a steady, largely unnoticed background level of small earthquakes, as the Pacific and North American plates continue grinding past each other along the San Andreas Fault and its many surrounding smaller faults. That constant, quiet activity is precisely why the state maintains one of the most sophisticated earthquake early warning systems in the world, some of the strictest building codes in the country, and an entire scientific community continuously monitoring for any meaningful change in a pattern that, for now, remains exactly as routine as it's been for as long as modern seismic monitoring has existed. If stories like this, the accurate version rather than manufactured urgency, are what you come here for, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because California's real earthquake risk is an ongoing story worth understanding correctly, whether or not any specific week happens to produce a dramatic headline. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.